Two of the best American Southwest authors, Cormac McCarthy and Edward Abbey, were friends. And this may come to a surprise to some of you guys because we hear all the time how Cormac McCarthy was only friends with other scientists and degenerates in society because they are the most interesting, and that writers are just navel gazing narcissists. But McCarthy was friends with multiple writers, and Edward Abbey was one of them. And if you guys have not read Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey, go buy it right now. It's one of the best environmental books written by an American of all time. And it shows us a mentality, lifestyle, and philosophy that most of us aspire and dream of getting, but don't have the ability to find anymore in our society. And the book comprises of the experiences of Edward Abbey in the 1960s while he worked as a park ranger in Arches National Park in Moab, Utah. And this is before Moab got run over by a bunch of tourists and mountain bikers. And interspersed between his eco revelations are ideas on how to restore nature back into, our consciousness. And he is a eco-anarchist or libertarian. So it's a much different approach to the Marxist environmentalism that we have been inundated with for decades now. Funny enough, Edward Abbey was also a fiction writer, and his best work and most famous work is called The Monkey Wrench Gang, which is about a bunch of eco-anarchists who are going to blow up the Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona. And it's a wild novel and not as good as any Cormac McCarthy novels in any sense, except that it's fun, it's political. And the novel also inspired the introduction of direct action into American environmentalism. And direct action is bringing people to physically stop the logging, the building of dams, and destruction of other wildlife habitats. And this is good for a while because you get press. But eventually, with too much direct action, as we're seeing now with environmentalists, you have a bunch of wimps, throwing paint on old famous paintings as a protest. And eventually, things get too political, and the anarchists and the Marxists take over. And that's what happened with those early groups inspired by Abbey. But nonetheless, him and Cormac actually connected in terms of environmentalism because supposedly they were going to try and wanted to reintroduce the wolf to southern Arizona. And this was in the late 80s, and I'm sure they'd be happy to know that now in Arizona there are over 100 Mexican gray wolves, and there actually is a jaguar in southern Arizona. And after Abbey's death, McCarthy wrote to J. Howard Woolmer that I lost another writer friend 2 weeks ago, Edward Abbey. I think he came across in his writing as something of a curmudgeon, but he was a kind and generous man, qualities, sad to say, not common to writers. And a curmudgeon is someone with a bad attitude. It's one of those McCarthy words that I had to look up before reading this to you. Even more cool, we have a 1986 letter from Abbey to McCarthy saying this. And you could say that Abbey was one of the early fans of Cormac McCarthy because only 1,800 copies of Blood Meridian were sold between 1985 and 1992. And Edward Abbey was one of those people who read it. And he says to McCarthy, quote, "Have just read Blood Meridian, a beautiful, terrible, splendid book. You must have made a compact with the judge himself to write such a book. I envy you your powers, salute your achievement, and dread not a little for the safety of your soul. Luckily, although wholly true, your book is not the whole truth, which you know as well as I. Now I must read your other books while looking forward to your next." And Abbey sadly never got to see All the Pretty Horses because he died in 1989. And if we look back at this passage, what is Abbey referring to here when he says, "Luckily, although wholly true, your book is not the whole truth, which you know as well as I"? I think he's referring to the deep secrets of the desert, of reality, the things that we don't necessarily see through the judge's, maniacal vision, but are somewhat present, when the judge speaks about the plants and geology, he says that they have a life of their own. So McCarthy was also inspired by Abbey through the Taoist Chung Tzu, if I'm saying that correctly. And this is so funny because when I was in high school, I was very inspired, like I'm sure some of you guys were, or at later parts in your life, by Taoism. And there is Lao Tzu, whatever the hell his name is. And then there is Chung Tzu, the very early, Taoists with their writings. And one of the Chung Tzu's, I'm saying his name wrong, but who gives a fuck? One of his most famous quotations and ideas is something that's been overplayed now by Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, and everyone else, but it's this passage. Also, mind you, this was written in the fourth century BCE, which was 2,400 years ago. A lot of people, this is just a side note, as someone who taught middle school history and now as a high school English teacher, a lot of people, a lot of students and even adults have if I say how long ago was 700 BC, roughly, none of my students know. A lot of adults don't know how to figure that out. I mean, it's insane. And so the statement passage goes, quote, once Chung Chao dreamt he was a butterfly flitting and fluttering around, happy with himself and doing as he pleased. He didn't know he was Chung Chao. Suddenly he woke up and there he was, solid and unmistakable Chung Chao. But he didn't know if he was Chung Chao who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was Chung Chao. Between Chung Chao and a butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. Pretty simple stuff for a lot of us, but Edward Abbey remixes this in the passage we're about to read. Then Cormac McCarthy remixes it again for Suttree. So let's read Edward Abbey's version of this in Desert Solitaire. Quote, I went native and dreamed away days on the shore of the pool under the waterfall, wandered naked as Adam under the cottonwoods, inspecting my cactus gardens. The days became wild, strange, ambiguous. A sinister element pervaded the flow of time. I lived narcotic hours in which, like the Taoist Chung Tzu, I worried about butterflies and who was dreaming what. I slipped by degrees into lunacy, me and the moon, and lost to a certain extent the power to distinguish between what was and what was not myself. Looking at my hand, I would see a leaf trembling on a branch. And man, talk about some fire statements right there. Beautiful stuff from Abbey. And we know McCarthy read and was inspired by this because in box 19, folder 14 of the Cormac McCarthy archive, he says, quote, butterfly dream in Chung Tzu, brackets, communal soul, Abbey. And I'll throw this up on the screen right now for you guys so you can see what McCarthy exactly wrote. So this was an inspiration for Suttree because there are a couple different elements that come into Suttree. First of all, a lot of these come up in the mountain scene where Suttree goes up into the mountains. And out there, he starts to lose the ability to differentiate between dream and reality. And we can kind of start bringing this together because they're like, how is this connected? Well, because McCarthy, in the margins near the section of where this was written was writing about this. And it seems to make a connection when you pull all this together. And at the end of the novel, when he's dealing with this fever, Cornelius says, quote, I know all souls are one and all souls are lonely. And that is the communal soul that Chung Tzu and Abbey were talking about. And we get a direct reference to the communal soul and the liminal aspects of reality in Blood Meridian when McCarthy says, quote, for although each man among them was discreet unto himself, conjoined they made a thing that had not been before, and in that communal soul were wastes hardly reckonable, more than those white regions on old maps where monsters do live, and where there is nothing other than the known world save conjectural winds. And McCarthy, as you guys know, was also working on Blood Meridian as he was writing Suttree, so that's also maybe where this term really pushes through. And then closest to where this appeared in the margins, McCarthy also writes in the mountain scene, quote, that Suttree, first in dreams and then in states half wakeful, before 2 days more had gone, he hardly knew if he had dreamt or not. Old distaff Celt's blood in some back chamber of his brain moved him to discourse with the birches, with the oaks. A cool green fire kept breaking in the woods, and he could hear the footsteps of the dead. Everything had fallen from him. He scarce could tell where his being ended or the world began, nor did he care. So I think this is actually a great example of kind of thematic inspirations that McCarthy pulls from different authors. And people think that this is, kind of a taboo practice or don't do it very often. But it's really important to find the iconic writers of the time, people who had in the past 2 or 3 decades, and still take a lot of their big themes and ideas because if they did it successfully, that you can do it too. And if you throw it into your very unique story, it's not like you're really stealing. You're just adding something that is going to be effective because it hit you deeply. If you were just writing on your own without other writers, then you're just playing guesswork and hoping that it's going to resonate with other people. And so, once again, the way that you can guarantee that you can be a great writer is to, first of all, be a great reader. And then with enough practice on the writing side, you'll be able to at least get to a publishable level of writing, even if you don't have any talent.